Hello and welcome to Red May, Seattle's celebration of radical art and thought. This is our 8th year, and we have a mix of in-person and live events, including movies at the Beacon, talks at Elliott Bay and Town Hall, and dialogue at Mini Mart City Park. Today we have a panel on Marx, Spinoza, and Althusser. Today speaking we have Tracie Matysik, history professor at UT Austin and co-editor of Modern Intellectual History, who wrote the book When Spinoza Met Marx, Experiments in Non-Humanist Activity. We also have Jason Reed, a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine, and author of multiple books on Spinoza, Marx, and Althusser, including the very recently published The Double Shift, Spinoza and Marx on the Politics of Work, which we'll have a talk on later this month, June 1st at Elliott Bay. And then we also have Nick Nesbitt, professor of French and Italian at Princeton. His most recent book out today is Reading Capitalism, Materialist Dialectic, Marx, Spinoza, and the Althusserians, out from the Historical Materialism series from Brill. And then I'll leave it to Nick to start us off.
I was having some feedback there. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank Red May. It's great to be back and have the opportunity to discuss some of these ideas that we put forward in that I put forward in this new book, and to do so with Tracie Matysik and Jason Reed, whom it's really an honor to join in conversation. And I'm glad to meet you, and I want to say how much I've learned from and respect your work. So it's great to be able to discuss some of these ideas here. I think that we've decided that maybe I would give a quick presentation of some of the ideas in the book and how I hope that it will constitute an intervention in some related fields, maybe 20 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion or follow with Tracie or Jason and Tracie. We'll see. So the book, I should first say, is thanks to Brill Historical Materialism in that series. I'm really happy to see it there, and I want to thank them for the great editorial work that they've done. It was originally slated to be released at the end of August, and now thanks to their diligent editorial work, it's actually released today by chance, could we say? And it's actually not quite downloadable on Brill's website. It's an open access book, but they tell me after the holiday today, hopefully by tomorrow, it should be. So it's open access, and I hope it'll stimulate discussion in a lot of quarters. So it's entitled Reading Capitals, Materialist Dialectic, Marx, Spinoza, and the Althusserians. And what I wanted to do in the book, I think in essence, is to try to construct an intervention, let's say, in 3 different domains. And I could say them or present them in inverse order in the context of discussions of Althusser and Althusserianism. So I have this sort of awkward word in the title, the Althusserians. I don't know. Hopefully it does the work I need to, even if it's not too elegant. But I wanted to make an intervention in Althusserian and post-Althusserian thought and studies, and in our understanding of Spinoza, particularly in light of his French reception in the 1960s and afterwards, in particular, both through Althusser himself and through Pierre Macherey. Then finally, I wanted also to try to make an intervention in Marxian studies, in the study specifically of capital itself, and specifically how we read capital, right? So already, maybe you can sense that the focus is going to be Spinoza's readings of Marx's Capital in the wake of Althusser, Macherey, Rancière, and Balibar's and Establé's reading Capital from 1965. And so I wanted to try to make various forms of intervention in those three fields. And so I begin with a sort of preamble, and I just sort of pose the straightforward question whether we still live in the capitalist social form or not, because of course we have many recent books telling us we're somewhere else, and not only recent books, that this is some other social form, that this is some post-capitalist situation that we now live in, and I wanted to begin for various reasons just with that simple, straightforward proposition, sort of axiomatic proposition that in fact we do still live in the capitalist social form, and that as opposed to all the various complex criteria that one could marshal from traditional Marxism and modes of production and these sorts of complex Marxian discussions, I think that there's a very simple criterion, which is simply that that the essentials for human existence, and in particular food, are largely, generally, not to say universally, available only as commodities. That if you don't have money in your pocket or a monetary cipher on your screen, you're at risk for starvation, and as well as housing, clothes, shelter, etc. That they're all commodities. That we live in a situation of general commodification, and then that, as such, I take as a sort of Spinozist, a first Spinozist point, right? That we have a true idea of what capitalism is. That we can start with it's inadequate, but it's true. It has to be further developed, but it's nonetheless a true idea. We have a true idea, and I take that true idea not out of nowhere, but from the first sentence of Capital, right? That in societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, these appear as an immense accumulation of commodities, which I take to be Marx's axiomatic and it's important, materialist starting point. That is a functional, true, minimally adequate definition of capitalism. That the capitalist social form is defined as the general tendency or predominance of the production, the exchange, and the accumulation of commodities, general commodification of all things and relations. So from that starting point, then I move into, again, going in reverse order, into a discussion of Althusserianism, and in particular, Althusser himself and reading Capital. So that dimension of the book, I think we could say, is essentially a sort of défense et illustration of theoreticism, right? There's this reigning dominant idea in post-Althusserian studies that theoreticism is an epithet. It was a problem. It was a dead end. It was mistaken, right? And the term itself being taken from, of course, Althusser's self-criticism, right? In I think it's 1973, Éléments d'autocritique, where he said, in fact, if we were guilty of the sin, in essence, he said, if we were guilty of the sin of theoreticism, it's because we were Spinozist in reading Capital, right? He says, and so I wanted the book to be an intervention in the sense of a defense of theoreticism, which is to say that the theoreticism of Reading Capital was in fact correct, and that we could then take that proposition to encompass a key concept, not the sort of revisionist term of theoreticism. That epithet is Althusser's own sort of, let's say, theoretically masochistic revisionism, but theoretical practice. The concept of theoretical practice, as he puts it forward in For Marx and Reading Capital, which is precisely in, for example, in that famous first introductory chapter of Reading Capital, he plays it against empiricism. Right, the problem is empiricism, and he lays it out in different ways. For example, Hegelian expressive teleology and totality, etc. The problem is theoreticism. The answer is theoretical practice, and that concept in itself is already, of course, a Spinozist one, right? That often in Reading Capital, the Spinozism underlying it, right, where Althusser will later say in that autocritique, we were Spinozist. But if you read Reading Capital, there aren't that many references to Spinoza, and yet all the way through, so many, especially the articles of the chapters of Althusser and Pierre Macherey are Spinozist. So theoretical practice, that concept is typical in that sense, right? It's an Althusserian rendering or rebranding of that basic Spinozist idea, verum index sui et falsi, right? That the truth is the index of itself and the false, which is to say that the truth, in this case of Marx's argument in Capital for the logic of the capitalist social form, what is the capitalist social form, is not to be attested by its historical legacy, right? As Engels said, you know, that the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, right? But verum index sui et falsi tells us something different. It says that the proof of the pudding is in the pudding. The proof of the truth of Marx's demonstration in Capital, in that open, unfinished, untotalized project that is Capital, is in the adequacy or inadequacy, as it may be, but in the adequacy of his demonstration, of his argument there. And theoretical practice, Althusser's idea of theoretical practice, is essentially taking up that position. And so I look at Reading Capital, I turn back and focus on that 1965 book, and I look at it, could say, in a sort of via a sort of chiasmatic paradox. We could say, on the one hand, that readings of the book Reading Capital, Lire le Capital, never refer, the secondary literature that is on Lire le Capital, Reading Capital, never refers to Das Kapital, to Marx's Capital. And on the other hand, readings of Das Kapital in the enormous literature we have never refer to Reading Capital, Lire le Capital. And so I wanted to work through various dimensions of that paradox. And so another moment that Spinoza comes in here again and again for me is in that first proposition of Book 4 of the Ethics. Nothing a false idea has that's positive is annulled by the presence of the true insofar as it's true, which, following Macherey's reading of that in his exposition of Book 4 of the Ethics, I take to signal that the weaknesses of Reading Capital. How do we understand the fact, for example, that both that readings of Reading Capital never refer to Capital and that readings of Capital never refer to Lire le Capital? and we know that there are all sorts of impediments. But I start from the position that reading Capital makes a true, correct, if inadequate, proposition, one that has, if you think about what has been written about reading Capital, you almost never that I can recall, come across this. But it makes a true proposition, an epistemological proposition of how we're to read Capital, right? That, in fact, and this follows from Althusser's anti-Hegelian arguments for Marx, and he develops them right in Reading Capital, that the process of exposition in Capital is not a Hegelian one. That it's not characterized by Aufhebung, by a negative dialectic, by Reflexionsbestimmungen, by the negation of the negation, etc., but rather that it's a positive dialectic. And if I look at what page is that? Page 51. This is the new or recent now complete edition of Reading Capital. On page 51, Althusser makes this, what for me is the central proposition of this book, certainly of Althusser's intervention. In Capital, we find a systematic presentation, an apodictic arrangement of the concepts in the form of that type of demonstrational discourse that Marx calls analysis. And for me, that's a positive proposition. It's not just Capital is not Hegelian, but it's positively, it deploys an original positive form of a dialectic of demonstration and exposition, and so that also guides I would say, the epistemological focus of the book. I see time is passing here, so I'm gonna speed up so we can hear Tracie and Jason. There's an epistemological focus on theoretical practice, on Marx's scientific practice as a positive dialectic of the demonstration of the necessary characteristics governing the appearance of things in the capitalist social form. So, for example, it's not a book about political practice, it's about theoretical practice. And, there were all sorts of factors that weakened this proposition, weakened its, in that Spinoza sense, its ability to displace the false idea that we have in this case about reading Capital, that it's essentially a palimpsest of Hegel's logic, right? And we still have huge expositions of that, deploying that thesis today in very creative, interesting, inventive ways. But I would say that they have imaginary deficiencies, let's say. And some of the things that weaken the reception of that key proposition, that there's a positive dialectic and apodictic arrangement of the demonstration in Capital, Althusser says, Reading Capital was just a seminar that was written up into a book. Its second edition cut out the essential essay of Pierre Macherey, which is where the actual work, even though it's only on the first 5 pages of Capital, the actual work of showing that there's a positive dialectic deployed in Capital, that's where he does it, right? So Althusser sends Macherey, you write it up, and he writes it up, and then that little chapter gets cut from the second edition, which means that it got cut from all the world translations until the last few years, when that's finally been revised. Macherey himself has disavowed that chapter and said, it's all just Althusser's project. But I think that chapter is brilliant, and it starts a whole tradition in reading Capital as a dialectic that I think culminates, for example, in the work of somebody like Michael Heinrich today. There's a great little essay in the new Italian translation of Wissenschaft vom Wert, the science of value, where Vittorio Morfino argues that Heinrich is an Althusserian, and that Althusserianism in the science of value is crucial. But I think that if we look in books like How to Read Capital, that book from 2021 in English, it goes much farther. That it's almost as though Heinrich is an Althusserian. I don't know. So there are other things. I think that the theory of class struggle in theory is a sort of regressive, revisionist regression to a traditional subject-object theory of knowledge. May 68, the demand for practice rather than theory. All these things sort of hobble the focus and the reception of that epistemological proposition. And instead, so the book takes a sort of has to take a sideways point of attack on the question, because these Althusserian figures, right? Althusser, Macherey, and not so much Balibar, but Badiou as well, stop talking about reading Capital after 67. Although there's this really fascinating 1967 Cerisy volume where Balibar and Macherey drove down to the 100th anniversary celebration of Capital in 1967. Etienne Balibar told me this story, and they sort of bombed the gathering, and it's written up in the Cerisy publication. And essentially what Pierre Macherey does is he applies the arguments of theory of literary production from the year before to Capital, which is to say it's almost that chapter in this 1967 book, the Cerisy book, is almost should be an additional chapter to theory of literary production. That is, all of the categories and concepts and approaches in that book by Pierre Macherey, he also applies to the reading of Capital. And so the argument in general is that Althusser in his archive, Macherey especially in his readings of Spinoza, Hegel or Spinoza, but especially the 5-volume, I know Jason wants to talk about this, so I won't say much more, the 5-volume exposition of the ethics, which I think is just a masterpiece, and it's totally scandalous that it's not translated into English, and that the 2nd volume, which is just a work of genius, is out of print. You can't even find it in French. Anyway, so I wanted to do some little bit of justice to that work and Badiou. So then there's some 2 chapters at the end arguing that Badiou, who has never discussed Capital in 200 some books that he's published, has actually, especially in Logics of Worlds, has developed at an abstract level this Althusserian idea of a materialist dialectic, specifically in that book as an abstract phenomenology, which is to say as the science de l'apparaître, as he calls it, the science of appearance. In this, and I try to read it as the science of the appearance of things, their necessary forms of appearance in the capitalist social form, even though in that 600-page book, Badiou never mentions capitalism. And Etienne Balibar plays a sort of subterranean role through the whole thing, but because he hasn't really been interested explicitly in epistemology in his work, it's more, as I say, subterranean. So Spinoza, I won't say much. I'll leave that to our experts here. But I really, as I say, wanted to shine a spotlight on Pierre Macherey and his amazing, underappreciated, brilliant work. That book 2 of his critique, since my focus is epistemology, book 2 of the ethics, of course, and his commentary on book 2 of the ethics is incredible. And then thirdly, just to wind it up, to stop here, Marx. So all of those things, I hope that they will be consequential interventions and provoke some discussion. But that the 3rd chapter on Marx is where I really want to try to throw some weight behind this proposition that Althusser makes, right, in this Spinozist way, that the true on its own doesn't have power to displace the false. And so you really need to make a substantial argument that doesn't ever get made by the Althusserians about explicitly Capital, certainly not in reading Capital. That Althusser was correct, that Marx deploys a positive dialectic, and so I put it in terms of a gradual tendential displacement of an initial deployment, say in the Grundrisse, right? It's all over the place, that those Hegelian categories and all, a tendential displacement of that Hegelian logic from 1857, 59, the Grundrisse, etc., through the drafts in the 1860s, including the first edition in 1867, which is still very strongly carrying many of those Hegelian logical categories, and to focus especially on the ways that the 1872 German edition, and especially in a really, I think, interesting, compelling way, the 1875 French edition, which of course doesn't get enough attention since Marxologists tend mostly to be Germanists, understandingly, but that 1875 edition is incredible in many ways, and I hope that I've identified one of the key ones, which feeds back onto the relation of Spinoza and Marx that Tracie has so brilliantly elaborated in her wonderful book. And I'll just say that the little detail that I dig out in here, instead of trying to share my screen, I'll point everyone to the little red chapter 11, Rate and Massive Surplus Value. And of course, that's the place where Marx quotes Spinoza, aside from the notebooks, right, preparing for the dissertation itself, and one or two other little places along the way. In Capital, this is the place, and often it's mentioned. Well, that mention of Spinoza refers back to the appendix of book 1, but nobody that I've ever read goes any farther. But why in that chapter? And so I try to read the chapter specifically as a Spinozist intervention, even though it's just sort of flagged, and who knows, conscious, unconscious, who cares? Objectively, that chapter, that little 9-page chapter, is a Spinozist intervention, in that double sense, the double sense that, first of all, it's a critique of illusory forms of appearance, of ideology, the ideology that predominates in the capitalist social form, both as sort of everyday lived experience, but also, for Marx says, for the classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, etc., that none of them are able to pierce that ideological illusion. And that's obviously a Spinozist dimension, but then also this positive sense of before he points to that, let's say, ideology critique, the chapter itself is a brilliant, succinct presentation of this materialist dialectic that doesn't proceed by contradictions and Aufhebung, and it proceeds by what Althusser called in the 70s la position des concepts, the positioning, the exposition of a given concept, its positioning, it's full exposition, then what Macherey called its exhaustion. When he's done, then he moves to the next concept. But that first exposition isn't overcome or rendered contradictory, or et cetera, or sublated, et cetera. No, it's positioning one after another. And this chapter is a brilliant summation of that in a quick form. And so it also is Spinozist. And the sort of crowning moment of that, for me, is everybody will be familiar with this little, where is it there? This little, with Lacan, I would call it a mathème. It's more than a mathème, right? It's more than just sort of a Lacanian musing, right? It is systematically a mathematical formalization, but right, if I'm arguing that there's a tendential displacement and disappearance of Hegelian logics of Aufhebung, this nobody seems to have noticed that it only appeared. Marx dropped it in the 1875 French edition. So for me, it's sort of a crowning moment in my attempt at a demonstration against the heavy weight of what I think is this false understanding of Marx's process of exposition as a palimpsest of Hegel's logic, that there is this tendential elimination and of that logic and its replacement by a novel form of materialist positive dialectic. Okay, I'm going to stop there. There's lots more to say, but I want to hear what Tracie and Jason have to say, and thank them for being here.
Jason, do we have an order of responding?
We really should have figured that out first. We do not. I'm happy either way. I'm happy to go. How do you want to go?
Either way as well. I can start. Maybe I have some sort of bigger picture questions, so I don't know if that's better next or.
Why don't you go? That sounds
Okay.
good.
I do have to pull up my little sheet here. You know, I have a little summary of the book, but I think you've just given us that. So, but I think for me, key to what you have done here is to lay out the stakes of what you're calling theoretical practice. And so I want to come back to that in a moment. But one thing that just got me quite excited, in part, it's just the fact that you're going back to Althusser and Macherey in particular. I found this to just be, I would like to show you my book. I'm not going to, but my PDF of it, because I do this multiple colors of shading, and I seem to be highlighting on some pages almost every sentence. So it made it hard to try to sort out what I thought was very important. So I'm just going to talk more about what I was quite excited about, I guess, and wanting to hear more from you about. So in the introduction, you speak about the anxiety and exhilaration that Althusser induces. And this seems right to me. The anxiety, as I see it, is twofold. One element is the anxiety my students experience when they read Althusser and the pushback I get from him, because he does not tell them what to do. He does not provide a philosophy of practice in the sense of taking to the streets. So that would be mere disappointment with him, and hence his relegation to the realm of mere theoreticism, if it weren't for the other dimension of his thought that induces anxiety. And that's what I think you point to very well, the relentless and convincing challenge to all, as we would say in Spinoza's terms, superstitions. His relentless exposure of the myth of humanist autonomy, his relentless critique of empiricism, his relentless refusal of an ontological ground, be it materiality or monism, in favor of a logic of immanent causality in both mind and extension. So for those willing to follow him and to live with this anxiety, there's also exhilaration, as you aptly call it, a sense of grappling with the logic of ideology itself without resurrecting a new ideological ground. So there was for me an anxious exhilaration as I read the book and as you tore away the ideological ghosts one by one. After Althusser, you work with Macherey to undo the logic of hermeneutics and interpretation. I love his theory of literary production, so I was happy to see it get its due. Here with Macherey, you pull down the myth of trying to get to the core or truth of authorial totality of a text. And in its place, you and Macherey propose materialist analysis and the novel construction of the object of analysis, that one actually produces the object while analyzing it, rather than trying to get back behind or inside the object to grasp its inner truth. You then, as I see it, use this method and also the axiomatic logic of Badiou to produce anew Marx's Capital and its logic, exposing the myth of its supposed Hegelianism, as you say, so yet another superstition that you are tearing down. And in place of Hegelianism, you produce a capital that operates according to an additive, what your terms, additive synthetic practice. According to this analysis, capital starts with the one true idea, the nature of the commodity as a product of abstract labor, and it builds concepts from there. You show that this is a purely intellectual project, non-empirical, and a system of true concepts. So if I understand right, the politics of the book is then a politics of reading, a politics of thinking. if that is correct, then I would love to hear you, and here I'm going to get into my questions. I would love to hear you talk, particularly here at an intellectual but non-academic forum, about what the politics of theoretical practice are. Can you just elaborate that a little bit? Related, I would love to hear you describe what your method is in this book. I sort of have attributed to you here a project following Macherey and Althusser, but is that how you understand your method, and how then do you think about the more historical dimensions that you use in the book, and not just the theoretical dimensions? Second, I would love to hear you talk a bit more about what you call the subject that is produced through theoretical practice. That's your term on page Roman numeral 11. In many ways throughout the book, I intuited a commitment to a strong anti-humanism, an effort to clear away subjective, imaginative knowledge in favor of common ideas and rigorous concepts. And I'm very comfortable with that move. I like this. But there is a strong and overwhelming tendency in today's Spinozist Marxism to try to salvage a partial subject in some fashion, not a humanist autonomous subject, but some version of a desiring, partially acting, usually something like a trans subject of some sort. So can you say something about what you want to say here with the subject that is produced through theoretical practice? Okay. So many questions, but okay, this is the other really big one. Yours is one of the most sustained efforts to think through what the positive dialectic is. And yet I would still like you to talk through it a bit. Is Macherey's positive dialectic the same as Althusser's materialist dialectic? In describing Marx, you usually refer to a synthetic materialist dialectic or an additive synthetic dialectic. So can you just help me a bit more with your understanding of these concepts? I think I've always understood Macherey's positive dialectic to still be directly tied to the notion of infinity, though an infinity that is immanent causality, and the production of finite moments out of the logic of immanent causality without negation of that logic of immanent causality. And it's that crucial, there's no negation of the logic of immanent causality that makes it positive. But I'd like to hear more from you on that. And then finally, I have lots of little questions, but this is my last big question, and I'll stop after this. It's a sort of outside question, but not for you. So Spinoza's Marxism has been rather poor at addressing some of the big issues of the day and of the last many centuries, and some of the failures of Marxism, namely to address colonialism, decolonization, history of slavery, politics of race. It's been a little bit better on feminism, but still rather inadequate. And I include my own book in this charge. It was very Europe focused. But you have done so much on the Haitian Revolution and the Black Caribbean critical theory. Is there a way to connect? How would you connect what you've done here to some of these other issues that are important to the way we might want to think about Marxism in the 21st century? And I can ask more detailed questions as we go in the chat, but those are sort of the big ones I want answers to.
Wow, thank you. Those are big ones.
You can answer
great.
none of them, or
I want also to say I learned so much from your book on Marx and Spinoza, and there's so much in there that I'm really happy to have this conversation. I'm really happy that you like the book as well. That is great. You started out focusing first on theoretical practice. You want and the idea of theoretical practice, and
or explicitly the politics of theoretical practice.
Okay, yeah, that's so. Yeah, this is the first discussion I've had about the book, and so you're pushing me to bring together some threads that have been in parallel. Let's say, so I start, as I said, with a sort of defense and revindication of theoretical practice. And that is a Spinozist one, which is to say that following Althusser and I think Macherey as well, the adequacy of Marx's demonstration is the index of its own truth or falsity, as the case may be, adequacy or inadequacy. So that intervention of Althusser's theoretical practice was then in its hobbled reception in the practicism of the 1970s was sort of generally rejected, taking Althusser's own cues as mere interiority, right? As idealism, let's say, that it's just sort of theoretical idealism. But that doesn't take into account, as he says, we were Spinozist. And so if we're going to think about theoretical practice as a Spinozist concept, it brings us immediately to the category or the concept of substance. And that's a whole box of problems in Althusser, because Althusser, and this is something I also want to celebrate, these two books that I saw Jason mentioned again yesterday by Jean Matysik and sorry, I'm forgetting his three first names, Estop, the amazing books about Althusser, the latter about Althusser and Spinoza, the former about Althusser and reading Capital, which I'm also building on, but neither of those, what I think I'm doing in addition, is Marx. Neither of those actually talks about what all this tells us about reading Capital. But that is to say that if we take theoretical, I mention those because they both also celebrate and try to revindicate theoreticism and theoretical practice and reading Capital, etc. But if we take theoretical practice as a Spinozist intervention, then all of that depends upon not the monism, but the how to see, this is what Macherey is so great at, avoiding saying that being is one, that it is a one, etc., that it is monist. Tracie, you have this wonderful exposition of Plekhanov's Spinoza's monism, and so that's very much what Althusser, I try to work that through what he's refusing, and Macherey follows him in that. Let's put it this way. Capital, the book, as a logic of the capitalist social form, not a history of capitalism, as Marx explicitly says in the forewords, etc. As a logic of capitalism is capitalism in the attribute of thought. Whereas our lived experience, here I see in my background, I know that I live in the capitalist social form because I sensuously see that everything around me, I cannot see anything that's not a commodity. This is a society. This room is capitalism. It's general commodification, as Marx says in the first sentence of Capital. That is capitalism also, in the attribute of extension, in the attribute of our sensuous, but it's inadequately understood, as Spinoza says it necessarily must be, as empiricism, as a mere sensuous, but it is nonetheless capitalism. And so those critiques, those simplistic, I would say, critiques of theoretical practicism didn't take into account this that we are capable of understanding capitalism through two attributes, thought and extension. And both of those, the book Capital, our sensuous apperception, are capital. There is only capitalism, although there is certainly a beyond of capitalism as well. All right. So theoretical practice. Let me just move ahead quickly. Anxiety, and there's another sub theme, a subterranean. I'd almost call it an affect of the book is Lacan and anxiety, right? And that, I think it's 1963 seminar, L'Anxiété, on anxiety, l'angoisse, by Lacan, is, I think, brilliant for understanding what Althusser is trying to accomplish. And I love your comment about your students and the anxiety of Althusser. It doesn't give us a sort of roadmap of what to do. I think Althusser wants to take us to this place where Lacan also wants to take the analysant. He wants to take us to a place of anxiety, put us there, and give us the strength to stay there, which is to say, not knowing, not having a roadmap, not knowing what we're supposed to do, but being exposed to ask the questions, and then the exhilaration, but also almost tragedy of Althusser is that for many reasons, overdetermined reasons, he doesn't give us the strength we need necessarily to stay there. Let's just say, to stay with Capital, the strength to stay with the book Capital as an untotalized, incomplete, open, unfinished mass of papers and drafts and things that Engels tried to stitch together, but it's not a totality. And all these Hegelian readings of Capital, virtually to a one, start with this assumption that capitalism, whether the logic, the book, the social form, is a totality. How can we stay in that place? And so, if we can follow the apodictic demonstration, the positive demonstration that Marx carries out, it can, in the attribute of thought, it can give us the strength to stay in that place and not knowing all the answers, not having a finished understanding, but nonetheless having a certain strength that we can take from the power of what Marx is nonetheless able to accomplish there. So Lacan, and this other question about the politics of reading and thinking and theoretical practice. I was lucky to have as a reader of the manuscript Nathan Brown, who raised a couple of brilliant problems that he pushed me to address in revising it. And one of the simple things he wanted to know is, all right, theoretical practice, but what about practice? and at that point I didn't have a conclusion, and so I said, okay, and that was the other thing, you need a conclusion. And so of course I needed a conclusion, so why not have a conclusion about theoretical practice today? And so, but still, if anyone gets to the end of the book and reads that, I still kind of punted the question, and I just sort of looked at Badiou's, I think, inadequate musings on his political practice in the Maoist political practice in the 70s and all, but I think that looking forward to a new project, that's precisely where I want to go, and I'm thinking, I just got the new. This new February edition of Lacan's, I guess it's 66, 67 seminar on what is analysis. And so there's this idea in Lacan that's a critique of revolution, right? What do you students want? A revolution? Well, you get a new master, right? And instead, he's proposing analysis. So of course, he's proposing it in the psychoanalytic setting. But I think that for me, some of the readings of Lacan and Marx don't go far enough. I think that one of the things that maybe we can develop from Lacan, the idea of anxiety is just one example, is the idea of analysis as something beyond revolution, which is to say the idea of revolution, as Lacan says, as a new master, rather than, I think, Capital, properly read, takes us beyond the capitalist social form through its critique and analysis. But that's looking forward. I don't know where that's going to lead. That's just my sense for the moment. My method, wow, that's a great question. I don't know how to answer that. I don't think it's Althusser, because my main point is that Althusser doesn't carry through his brilliant propositions of genius. He doesn't have the means for many reasons. Macherey's little chapter doesn't carry them through either. So my method, I try to work with Marx. And so your other question about slavery, post-colonialism, et cetera, I see in the background this picture that's on the cover of that book on capitalism and slavery that came out a couple of years ago. That would be sort of my answer, because that's also, I think, a Spinozist reconstruction of Marx's demonstration of the place of slavery in capitalism. For me, that's one way of addressing that question, which is to say that the method there, Spinoza and Marx are my masters, right? And in particular, Marx, in the first chapter, or first 6-7 chapters, but especially chapter 1 of Capital, that he revised the most of anything in the book of Capital. He was so careful, and this is what Heinrich shows so brilliantly in How to Read Marx's Capital, how he demonstrates each logical point. He exhausts that exposition systematically, then moves to what it not that it has contradictions. There's no contradiction between use value and exchange value, etc., but rather he's shown what use value is. So now he moves to the next attribute of the commodity, right? And so that's what I've tried to take as my method, is to follow Marx and Spinoza's rigor in their positive dialectic, what Macherey calls in his comments on, where is it, the preface to the emendation, right, where Macherey says that's the only place that Spinoza reflects on his method, and he contrasts it with Descartes' analytic method, and says precisely that synthesis is not simply heuristic. It's not just that we figured everything out and we want to teach it to the ignorant and so that they can grasp it. The actual exposition of the categories, Althusser would say, leur positionnement, positively, is the process of ethical emendation. It is how we get from the first sentence of the ethics to the last, and presumably are transformed as subjects of knowledge. I don't want to keep talking, so that last comment maybe carries in something of another question you had too.
No, I want to yield to Jason here. I just want to say, I think I cut out of my comments here that in ways I think your treatment of Capital was so I felt like it was a good example of Macherey's method in a sense. Capital is not a finished text for you. It's layered, it's contradictory. You have to go back between, there's not even a single text that's called Capital. And so you really did have to construct an analysis rather than there was no Marx that was the master of the text even. It's you're understanding the logic that pushed Marx to rethink over and over again and come back and circle around. And so it was a really great practice, whatever we describe that. It didn't create a text that we interpret and try to get to the truth of. It was a text that created the possibilities of you doing a certain kind of analysis. So I will let Jason.
Thank you.
And thank you for those great answers.
Yeah, thank you both. And thanks for such a great book. I mean, one of the things I think is very exciting about this book is, and as you mentioned, I kind of categorize it along with Juan Domingo Sanchez Estelp's book and Jean Mathi's book on Althusser, and that it's a different sort of turn to Althusser than the one that for me, like 25 some years ago when I was in graduate school, there was a lot of excitement about Althusser, brought about by the publication first in French and then eventually in English of some of the posthumous writings, the pieces on Althusser materialism, the manuscript on Machiavelli, etc. It was a different sort of Althusser. And I think what I find interesting about your book and some of these other turns is this is a turn back to the Althusserian of 1965, of his major theoretical interventions that really made him the name and produce a sort of Althusser effect in and through his students and in through the readings and rereadings. And in some sense, as we mentioned, it's reading Capital, which is very important to your take. And I'm going to have some questions about for Marx in a little bit, but I do think there's also a way in which this is a brilliant demonstration of theoretical practice as something which takes sort of what a generality one, or as you say in a more Spinoza's version, the one true idea we have, the dominance of the commodity form over our existence, and transforms that idea, which is inadequate, into a kind of knowledge. So it demonstrates theoretical practice, but there's also obviously a huge engagement with probably Althusser's most important concept of reading Capital, and that is structural causality. But I don't want to make this sound like it's just a kind of return to the 60s, because I think one of the things you also do very well is you return to that through especially Macherey's later development. And really, in some sense, Macherey ends Hegel or Spinoza with this argument of, a positive dialectic. And to some extent, I think you do a great job of showing what that positive dialectic looks like. Although I think it's interesting to point out that for Macherey, it was a dialectic without teleology. And for you, it's a dialectic without totality. Now, of course, those two concepts are connected, but there does seem to be a difference, at least of emphasis, around totality versus teleology. And then I think the really important thing that happens in this book, and this is something I wrote a little blog post about and helping to think about it, is, as you say, your insistence on the question of epistemology, and you're reading through a sort of Spinoza's epistemology, which, as you say, begins with this: we all have one true idea, it's an inadequate idea, but most importantly, the engagement with the common notions. And the common notions, which Spinoza says are neither in a part nor a whole, and are common sort of everything. And the example that Spinoza gives, of course, is motion and rest. And as you stress, the one thing about common notions, they don't have an empirical dimension tied to any specific thing. And I think one of the things I think is very interesting about that, in terms of, as you just mentioned, part 4 of the ethics, in terms of the limited efficacy of the true insofar as it's true, is that readings of Marx are burdened by this attempt to give his concepts some kind of empirical, like in a strange sort of way. Like one of the most annoying and persistent questions in Marxist thought is like, what is a real worker, right? It's sort of give an image, to give a particularity to what can only be thought, I think, for Marx, as a kind of relational structure, as determined by the situation of selling one's labor power, as it is determined by the relationship between concrete and abstract labor, and so on. I think that there's a lot to be said about thinking Marx in and through the common notions. But, and here's where I have a few questions. Your book, even though you're very critical of some of later Althusser, it does a very later Althusser gesture, in that Althusser talked a lot about, in the 70s, about theory as being a site of drawing a line of demarcation. And obviously for you, that some of the demarcation is precisely with the later Althusser. Although it also is, in some sense, a demarcation. This is one of the ones I was most curious about, because Balibar says in an essay that there are always Althusserians of the structure and Althusserians of the conjuncture. And he draws this line of demarcation, really between the two texts from 1965, for Reading Capital and for Marx, and that some really move with this idea of structural causality, and others move with the conjuncture. And it seems to me that, I mean, I understand, you know, your opposition to things like class struggle and theory seem abundantly clear as to why that is a dead end for you. But overdetermination seemed like more of a question for me. And to what extent overdetermination could be a continuation of the non-totalizable addition of the different determinations. That seemed to be a real question for me. And with that, there is a question about the turn to Badiou. And one of the things I found, I mean, to be honest, I don't mean like, I laughed out loud a couple of times in your chapters on Badiou because, and I'm not saying this in a disparaging way about Badiou but the way in which you keep saying like, Badiou never wants to talk about capital. He should really talk about capital. And it almost becomes like, it almost becomes sort of funny, the very mysterious. And it seems to me that, you know, for me, part of the question of why Badiou goes back to this question about the relationship between structure and conjuncture, because I feel like to some extent the Althusserians post-Althusser, I feel like Balibar has really maintained himself as a thinker of a conjuncture, right? He's really like, he wants to ask the question, what is happening in the racism now? What is happening with the border now? What is happening with violence now? And has continued this sort of conjunctural and doesn't really want to do a kind of structural. I mean, I think it's implicit in some of his thoughts about trans individuality or a continuation of this sort of structural moment. But Balibar would rather think in it through the conjuncture. I think to some extent, and this is a trickier point, Macherey's turn towards these very like layered analyses of, say, everyday life, or the texts that are come out of his courses, which sort of situate like the philosophy, the sociology, the literature, have a kind of conjunctural dimension to them as well. I mean, the return to a certain kind of Marxism in the book on norms is kind of another question entirely. But it seems to me that whereas I think Badiou, as you point out, the paradox of Badiou is he's very much a thinker of the structure, yet he doesn't entertain the question of capital in that structure. In fact, capital more or less really appears, or capitalism appears in Badiou more in the form of his polemics than in the form of his logics or his attempt to think through a logic. So I guess these two questions that I'm kind of ending is the overdetermination or the conjuncture. Where does it fit within the reading you're putting forward of Althusser and Marx? And with that, to me, the flip side of that is like Badiou seems to me to be, you know, the question you're asking with Badiou is, why does a thinker of the logic of the structure not engage with capitalism as a structure? So yes.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jason. Those are great, helpful comments and questions. The first one was about this distinction between totality and teleology, and I'd be curious to hear more about your thinking about teleology. The point, right, was that the end of Hegel or Spinoza, where Macherey talks about a positive dialectic, without teleology, and my focus, it's right, is more on totality, the absence of a logic of totality. One of the things that I try, one of the ways that so I also, in the book, Tracie's question about method, one of the things that I do take from Althusser and Macherey and Canguilhem, I suppose also, is the idea that there is no pre-existing object for this book, that the book itself has to construct an object that isn't, it's not an empirical, it's not a reading of this, whether it's a capital or reading capital, right? It's trying to construct a novel object. And one of the ways that it does that is trying to draw together all sorts of links. This is also to your question of overdetermination, right? That trying to, while making a a step-by-step argument, I'm also trying to make a network argument, right? In this way that Macherey so brilliantly shows, right, in his each of the 5 volumes on the books of the ethics, right? At the end of each one, he makes this table or diagram of how every proposition links to and refers to every other instance throughout the 5 books, and so he sees and in his commentary, he's constantly trying to get us to see the ethics as a network logic, and not only as a sequential demonstration that builds from the first sentence to the last. And in relation to the idea of totality, then one of the things that I took that I thought was so brilliant, we haven't mentioned Warren Montag's book about Althusserian as contemporaries, and one of the things I loved in that, I really liked his reconstruction of the critique of phenomenology and Lévi-Strauss, but also I love the way, and I learned so much from the way that he reconstructs that exchange between Althusser and his young student, right, Macherey, who reads the proofs, I guess, of reading Capital and starts writing to his professor Althusser and correcting him. Do you really need to make all of these references to the whole and to totality? It's totally superfluous to your argument. And furthermore, he doesn't actually say, but he implies, furthermore, it's just wrong. If you call yourself a Spinozist, right? Let's look at the was it letter 41, right? The worm in the blood, and we don't know a whole. I have no capacity as a finite thinking being to understand the totality of determinations. We are worms in the blood, and the idea of totality is just is always subjective and comparative and relational, etc. And it's incredible the way he Montag reconstructs that epistolary and presumably otherwise dialogue between the two, and then another dimension of the hobbled, weak intervention of reading Capital, right? That Althusser, instead of actually working through a response to Macherey's points, he just simply gets rid of the offending paragraphs, etc. So I tried to take there from that early Macherey, as well as the later Macherey and his comments on totality, and in the ethics books, in the Hegel and Spinoza book, etc. This critique of totality, and to bring it to bear on these contemporary, many, not only contemporary readings of Capital as a palimpsest of Hegel's logic, starting with the idea that capitalism is a totality, as a way of carrying forward Althusser's basic proposition that capital deploys an apodictic positive mode of demonstration, as Macherey showed it does in its first couple of pages. And what else did you say? Oh, structure and conjuncture, right? So I would hope that I'm not getting pegged in one of those boxes. I would like to be a structuralist and a conjuncturist, and so I've tried to learn from Spinoza, from Macherey, as I just said, and to construct a complex object that is a network form of knowledge, that we have to write in a linear fashion, but we can nonetheless think to the best of we can amend our capacities to think in a rhizomatic way, right? And hopefully I've made some progress doing that. And structurally, I'm if I'm gonna stick my head out for theoreticism and reading Capital and theoretical practice, I have to be in some sense a structuralist, which is to say not a Lévi-Straussian way of the combinatory, but an Althusserian way, in that which is to say, as you rightly point out, structural causality, that there is no essence, pre-existing essence that finds its Hegelian manifestation in forms of appearance, but rather that essence is coterminous and at one with its instantiation, right? And I don't know about overdetermination and what else, teleology. I want to hear what you have to say. And Badiou, it just is fascinating. I'm a reader of Badiou, and I love the book Logics of Worlds. And so, you know, okay, he couldn't care less about capital. I find it odd, paradoxical, strange for a Marxist, etc. It's just, as you say, part of his polemics. So I did it. I tried to do it. I tried to say that, wait a minute, if he's going to talk about la science de l'apparaître, the logic of a world, and at the same time elsewhere tell us again and again that our world is capitalism, and he's right, and yet the word capitalism never appears in Logics of Worlds, well, what does it imply? And it implies, in essence, simply that the book, one read this way, we can read the book Logics of Worlds precisely as a further formalization, a further degree, right? I flashed that one little formula in chapter 11 of Capital. We could think of Logics of Worlds as taken to the utmost degree of abstraction, to the point of never mentioning capitalism, logic, that process of modern science, right, as Husserl said, modern science is the tendency toward mathematical formalization, but not as a crisis, as Husserl thought, but rather as an intervention, as Spinoza thought, as the capacity of our human being to grasp the world more adequately through the attribute of thought. And I think Badiou does that to some degree, even regarding our world. So thanks for those great comments and questions. What else?
Philip, did you want to again? I was going to ask a question, but go ahead. I see you've just joined us.
Oh, yes, I did join you, but I've actually come for a commercial break. I'm going to beg for money for a second, but then to redeem myself for being so crass, I will throw out two questions to show that I'm interested in the conversation and not in only the bucks that you can contribute, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, to keep Red May going. We are a festival, of course, whose mottos are things like take a vacation from capitalism or be a commie for a month. And as you may imagine, there is no institutional money available to us. We depend entirely on the kindness of strangers like French Dubois. And I wanted to give you a couple of options to keep this mad project going if you enjoy this discussion as much as I have listening to it. One, you can contribute to our Patreon, which is on redmayseattle.org. There's a little thing that says donate on our website. Or you can go to a website called Fan the Flames of Red May. And there you can give one-time donations if you don't want to fall into that neoliberal subscription model that we all seem to have adopted now. So give if you can. We love doing this. And we love being kind of secret Spinozas. But I will throw out a couple of questions as I've been listening. One of them is around what I might call as the trope, the Borgesian trope of the secret duel. I mean, of course, one thinks of the moment where the Spinozist controversy and German idealism, where Reinhold says that Mendelssohn claims that before he died, Lessing claimed he was a Spinozist, and how big a controversy that was. And I wonder if, as we read Reading Capital and so forth, there's a secret duel going on with, of course, none other than not just Hegel, but Lukács, who is the kind of giant, and how one reads that duel now, and whether one could interpret Lukács in a generous fashion as being, like later Althusser, a theorist of the conjuncture, of the moment, taking from Hegel the idea that one never knows the meaning of any moment until retrospectively. So that would be one question about not trying to, I'm not seeking Althusser here to kind of bring Althusser and Hegel together in a new, but I'd like to keep the tension. But that would be one question. And my other question is from the philosophy of science, where I think this notion of an untotalizable, unfinished Marx that Heinrich picks up and that Althusser is presenting is not at all incompatible with how we think of science works, according to Lakatos and Kuhn. That essentially one is always throwing out parts of it and adding new parts of it as one constructs the theory, tracking sort of back and forth. And I like this vision of Marx and Althusser precisely because it goes against the common sense notion of scripture. The dogmatic Marxist who believes in Marxist Leninism laid down by Stalin, which is the science that predicts every stage of history or so forth, which has nothing to do with how anybody who reads Marx now reads him and thinks about this mystery of enigma of capitalism, which keeps on going and seems to have new capacities all the time that we have to adjust to. So those would be my two questions.
Jill, thanks. I don't know how far I'm going to go in answering them, but I love your image of the secret duos. And the first secret duo, the main, I would say probably the main secret duo in the book is Marx and Spinoza. First of all, before Lukács, which is to say that in the sort of central third chapter of the book, where I'm trying to bring this materialist dialectic back to bear on our way of reading Capital, it builds and sort of culminates, hopefully, in building on the work that Tracie's done, precisely on the relation between Marx and Spinoza. And of course, there have been quite a few things written about Spinoza's possible influence on Marx and the ways, trying to decipher from the ways that the dissertation notebooks, how they, and Tracie does a great job of showing how the actual arrangement and the few signal graphic signs that we have of relative importance, etc., of the ways that Marx chooses and arranges the quotations that he has from the TTM and etc. And what are we going to do that? But the point that I wanted to make was that all of the commentaries with which I'm familiar think about Spinoza's possible relation with Marx politically, socially, critically, etc. And I wanted to draw attention to epistemology, right? That there might be this other influence, which is as a mode of theoretical practice, a non-Hegelian mode of theoretical practice. And so I tried to point to some intimations of it in the dissertation, et cetera. And then I try to really drive that home with this commentary on chapter 11 in Capital, and try to build a case, right? What can you prove? But I try to build a case that Spinoza's influence was much greater than we've thought, if we think about epistemology and Marx's method of presentation, etc. So that's a secret, or maybe not so secret, but a duo that's going on there. And Lukács, I mean, I want to hear what others have to say about this. I think he only appears in my book at one brief moment, but it's kind of a, I don't know if it's a key moment, but it's when I'm trying to make a critique of the systematic dialectic school, the Chris Arthur school of reading Capital as a totality, as I'm saying a palimpsest of Hegel's logic, and it I think it goes to this Jason's point maybe about teleology, right? That I take Lukács as the preeminent evocation of the teleological necessity of revolution, right? In history and class consciousness, and to simply make the point that Arthur, writing, as you say, now in the 21st century, is reading Capital differently, but he's still reading it in a Hegelian teleological way, based on the idea of Capital as a totality. And so I guess Lukács plays a secondary role. I don't know how far I could go. That not having reread other parts of Lukács in a while, conjuncture and all. I'd like to hear what you have to think, and the philosophy of science as a sort of open, untotalized rejection of scripture. Here, I can't agree more, and I like. I tried to sustain that reading with Macherey, and it's one of the strongest things I think that we can take from his theory of, let's say, discursive production, this critique of reading a text in this scriptural way, as you say, and so instead I wanted to think about Capital as a science, as Marx explicitly calls it. And what does that mean? I think it means something Spinozist, that we can achieve an adequate understanding of the necessity governing the complex, overdetermined structure of a world, our world, and understand it in this scientific way that Spinoza says that we take from mathematics, right? That it gives us this real possibility, yeah. So those would be a couple of things that your questions suggest.
You know, can I jump in for a second? It's interesting to think about, like, Lukács in this context. If we think about the longer history, that there has been at all moments, and this is one of the things, you know, Macherey tells us that every century finds its own Spinoza, right? And I suggest it's every generation. And if you look at the Marx-Spinoza, or the Marx-Spinoza relationship from 1840s to present, there's always a coupling of attention. So we have that strong Hegelian Marxism in the 60s, right, against which Althusser and others are working. Lukács is also responding explicitly to Plekhanov. Lenin gets lumped in with Plekhanov, that they are these kind of, there's a strongly anti-teleological tendency in their thought, and that runs right up against, the only way they can sort of survive is to bring in a historical teleology from the outside. And it's a difficult one for them. And so Lukács is trying to generate a totality that is a dialectic that will guarantee that teleology that they need. You know, so there are moments where I just think we shouldn't read Lukács and outside of this very specific moment in which he's writing History and Class Consciousness in particular. And it is while the Spinozists seem to have power at the moment of the Russian Revolution. That will end, but at that very moment they do. So that is significant. So back to that idea that every generation or every century finds its own Spinoza. It's an interesting thing that Spinoza gives us so many different things to think about. Epistemology is one, but one of the challenges is always separating out, talking about ontology or epistemology. And this is one of the things that, Balibar and many others have said over and over again. That's what makes him so powerful. You can't think ontology outside of epistemology and politics and whatnot. And so I was thinking about that quote you have from Marx. It's the misquote, right? That ignorance is no excuse. And I too attributed it to the ethics appendix of book 1. And then later I was going through chapter 4 of the TTP, and I was reminded of this sentence referring to Paul, but they're talking about divine law. And so Spinoza is talking about Paul's epistle, and he says, so he concludes that all are without excuse and cannot plead ignorance, which they would be able to do in a supernatural light if they were relying on superstition. It's very, very close. And here he's definitely not talking about epistemology in the way we're talking about it here. He's talking about divine law and how it is that humans would ideally comport themselves if they understood God, if they understood more than themselves, right? And so ignorance is intrinsically related to at least ethical orientation of the individual, but probably also politics and religion. And I guess I just want to kind of make that observation because I think it's I think what you've done is just a tour de force. I mean, it's really, really extraordinary, but there's a kind of, following Althusser as well, if we think about Althusser versus Deleuze at this moment, Deleuze is going to focus on the affects, and Althusser is going to focus on epistemology in particular, and they're all both working in this anti-Hegelian sense. And it just reminds me, what does it remind me? It makes me still want to think about what else Marx is still doing with Spinoza, even when he's appealing to epistemology. I think you make just a fabulous case for that. My other question related to that is, do with that what you want. I just think it's an interesting conjuncture to think about. That's not a technical term of conjuncture. It's a combination of ideas to think about. My question is how important it is for you that Marx was thinking with Spinoza when he wrote Capital. Is that a historically important idea? Do you need that for the sake of your argument to say that he operates in a way that we could now identify as a Spinozist logic?
Should I
say
answer?
Whatever you want.
Two things. Maybe I'll answer the last first, which is no. Who knows? We don't know. Who the author, what the author was thinking. We're not doing. I don't know what to call it. Scriptural phenomenology or something. I'm a structuralist Spinozist Althusserian structuralist. So, what is the text doing? And what I find fascinating about that chapter 11 is that the text objectively is the one place in mature Marx where Spinoza plays. He shows up in this site, and that chapter is objectively Spinoza. So I try to make that case and show in both these negative ideology critique and positive dialectical senses, that chapter is Spinozist. And it's so is it an accident? What was he thinking? Who knows? It's there, it's in the text. That chapter is Spinozist. But nonetheless, that we can still reconstruct something that is, I think, interesting and compelling as a sort of overdetermined argument about this relationship, right? So that we can also look back to the notebooks, 1841, to the dissertation itself, because most of the Spinoza comments, right, are in the Young Marx, etc., and we can try to think about things. For example, I love your comment about chapter 4 in the TTP rather than the appendix, that referring to the appendix of volume 1. Sorry, what was I going to say? I just lost my train of thought. But did he know the ethics? So there are other clues. I tried to footnote a couple of those that he also, even though they're not in the notebooks, he also cited right? Verum exuit falsi. There's some. He knew to some extent the ethics itself and textual clues, the sort of detective work. It seems not only through Hegel, not only through Hegel's misreading, misquoting, but it seems that he actually knew the ethics itself. Well, anyway, so to put out that evidence and try to construct it into a compelling case, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that he wrote chapter 11 intentionally as a Spinozist intervention, but I think it takes our hopefully, I want it to take our understanding of the relation of Spinoza and Marx farther than it's been taken before. That is, to include the question of epistemology. Yeah. Oh, and guarantees. I wanted to say, you said the word guarantees, and one of the things that that takes me back to the idea of anxiety that you started with, right? And one of the things that I love and that is so maybe disturbing or anxiety provoking in Althusser is that he's a thinker who tries to always refuse guarantees. The first of those, primary among those, being substance, right? That the category of substance is one that he sort of evacuates from his Spinozism, and Estop and I think it's Matysik especially take that as a step beyond Spinoza. I try to make the argument that if we read Spinoza and the concept of substance specifically with Macherey, we can continue to think in this Althusserian way, where substance doesn't constitute a guarantee. It's not the monism of Plekhanov. It's not something that guarantees the correspondence, the parallelism, right, between thought and extension, which parenthetically Macherey destroys as an argument, I think, in his commentary on Book 2, Proposition 7, in the idea that Badiou himself carries on that there's a parallelism. That's Leibniz. That's not Spinoza. And anyway, Althusser tries to he rejects, he evacuates this category of substance among many other guarantees, and he tries to stick us out there in that theoretical place without such guarantees, to think structural causality, let's say, without essences, without substance, without all these other guarantees, but and to stay there and push through with it. So thank you.
Just a couple things I just want to say, and I got to get going soon. But so the one is Nick's question about teleology and totality. I mean, I'm really still trying to think about this, although I do think that it's worth pointing out, and Nick raised this when he talked about the back and forth between Macherey and Althusser, that I think it was easier for Althusser to draw a sort of line of demarcation with teleology than totality. I think totality was kind of a lingering problem, and I think to some extent that's part of that. That's integral to it's easier for Marxists to throw out teleology than it is to totality. I think that there's a way in which the totality is a much more lingering kind of problem than teleology. Although it seems to me that they both, I mean, that they necessitate each other. They go along in a sort of Hegelian reading. Totality and teleology seem to go along, but often in a very unstated sort of way, that they're just sort of the implied backdrop against which contradiction happens. And then this brings me briefly to say something about Lukács. I think that, I mean, Lukács, I think, one reading is that Althusser really considered Lukács to be the embodiment of what he called expressive causality, right? When Lukács says in History and Class Consciousness, there's no problem in a capitalist society which the commodity form doesn't solve, but the idea that commodity form is kind of like this kernel contradiction through which you could express everything else. And I do think that that's an interesting point to think through what it means to think a positive dialectic would be that there is no central contradiction. You have to add, and I think what Nick does in his book is show that the the commodity then gets us to two sides of labor, and then from there we get into the that you can't just boil everything down to one kernel contradiction. It's always kind of adding on different determinations, which I think is a great way to put it, which also brings me back to, and here's a better way to, I think, pose this structural causality versus overdetermination question, which is, and this is something that people like Montag talk about, is that it seemed at times that Althusser really wanted to equate overdetermination with a third kind of knowledge in Spinoza. I mean, he does this a little bit with the Tractatus Theological Political Treatise when he says that Spinoza gives us one version of a singular case with his version of the, with his discussion of the ancient Hebrew state, that to some extent that for Althusser, it seems to me that there is a distinction to be made between, in some sense, structure as kind of the common notions necessary to think any specific moment in history, and then the idea that the third kind of knowledge is thinking the specific articulation at a specific point in time of how those different common notions are articulated and manifest. And I know that there's a big debate in this in Althusserians about like this idea of mode of production versus social structure, and this sort of, is there a higher level of analysis than a mode of production, or a more specific level of analysis, and how does this map onto a kind of second and third kind of knowledge in Spinoza? Seems to be an interesting question to think about here. So that's all I got to say about that.
Those are great questions, Jason. And comments. It reminds me. So I keep bringing it back to Lacan, but there's a moment in there where one of the few things I guess I take from late Althusser are those reflections on singularity and right, and there's that wonderful passage where he's discussing, I think it's in Future Lasts Too Long, where he's discussing my Spinozism, our Spinozism, etc. And he talks about the distinction between common notions and the third kind of knowledge as the distinction between the common and the singular, right? And so that I think reading Capital, and certainly what I've tried to do in this book, in the third chapter about Marx and how to read Capital, is focused on common notions, and the way that you brought that out really strongly in your comments and what you wrote online as well. The common notion as the sort of as Marx puts it, what does he say? The law. I've forgotten the phrase. The law governing the capitalist social form. It's law of motion. Sorry, it's law of motion. And so that's a common notion, like the law of gravity, right? And in that late Althusserian text, right, he talks about psychoanalysis. I don't remember. He talks about Lacan, but he talks about analysis, and I think it's such a great example, because if we think about psychoanalysis, you have, oh my God, I forgot to turn this damn thing off. Sorry. If you think about psychoanalysis, you have, or what Lacan's doing, for example, with the mathème, right? He's making the mathème into some kind of a common notion about the psychic apparatus, right, and how it functions in common, universally, right? But at the same time, psychoanalysis, that's why I'm so eager to read this 1966-7 chapter about what is the project and goal of analysis. The practice of analysis is the singular, right? You can't take the mathème of the psychic apparatus to the person on the couch and make their life better. You have to, through the process of analysis, you have to address the singularity of a case. And so I think what does that tell us about capitalism, the critique of capital, et cetera? I don't know. That's something that I want to keep thinking about. But it at least points us again in the direction of that of where we started, right? Theoretical practice, political practice, and beyond. If we have a substantial theoretical practice, analytical practice, and we come to understand maybe not the universal notions of a case, the capitalist case, the capitalist social form, and nonetheless, if we understand its regularities, its law of motion, that an adequate understanding and analysis takes us potentially somewhere else, not just to a new master, not just to more of the same, but rather potentially, hopefully, ideally, to the limits of the capitalist social form, so that whatever the real is on the other side of that, we can try to grasp it, right? Because Lacan says we do have some access to the real. It's through formalization. It's through adequate analysis that we can get beyond this world, this situation, this social form.
Philip, I see that in the chat you guys were discussing whether or not there were questions from online.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, Ranjan, there are no questions, are there? There weren't a couple of moments ago. I think it sounds like Jason has to leave. And I think we should end at this point. It's a pity to do it. I wish this was live and we would head off to a bar and continue this because it was going in very interesting directions. But thank you all for a wonderful discussion. And I hope wherever you are, the weather is as good as it is in Seattle now, and you can go out and just chill on a lawn and do whatever you like for the rest of the day. For anybody who's watching this, check out the website, www.redmayseattle.org, because we have the schedule of events that are coming up. We have Jody Dean, who needs all the solidarity from anybody who can give it, for being outrageously relieved of teaching by the Hobart and William Smith administration after she wrote a terrific blog on the Verso. It's part of the crazy, ferocious surge of anti-Semitism madness that is rivaling the McCarthy period for anyway. But check out our schedule. We have great stuff coming up, and we'll see you at some of them. So thank you, everybody.
Can I say in closing, first, again, thank you for this conversation. I'm so excited to read the next book on analysis beyond revolution. So get on that one. And thank you again. This was great.
Thank you, Tracie. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Philip, for the questions and invitation. It's really such a pleasure and an honor to have this discussion.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.